All right, good morning and welcome to the first in our Think New York series, a new webinar series the Empire Center is hosting. We're joined today by the founder and senior fellow of the Empire Center, EJ McMahon, who's here to talk with us about migration and population trends in New York. Just a quick word on format. EJ is going to give us a very interesting slideshow, which I've been able to preview. And then we're going to save time at the end for Q&A. I will moderate that, so if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A section, which is down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. EJ, I see you're in a sling. I assume you were mauled over by a moving truck on its way out of New York, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
That was it. Somebody was just stampeding to get out and ran me over, and I cracked my elbow. So, but
All right. Why don't we get started?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. And hello. I see a lot of names on the list I recognize. Hello again to most of you. Um, this seemed like a good time, since a lull as much as anything in the usual statistical release action, to talk about the one of the most talked about trends demographically affecting New York State, which is outmigration. This is the outflow of New York residents net to other states, and what the trend has been, what's new and what's not new, and what we might expect in the years ahead. So, without any further ado, I'll just run through some slides, some of the key data. There's nothing in this that is new, I should say, right from the start. There's not strikingly new analysis here, although you may not have seen some of this before if you didn't see the release in the first place. But what I'm going to go through, I think, helps, to create, or is designed to create, a context in which to think about migration and how it's affecting the state and its economy and also its tax base. So I'll go now. I think I have control of the slides. There's our theme photo that we often use on this subject. I'm going to start by talking about some of the stories you've seen and what they mean and what they may be overstate. It's a favorite go-to topic for a lot of media in the state, especially business media. And as you've seen stories like this, for instance, this one from the New York Post, which is based actually on a survey of New Yorkers a few months ago, in which a majority of New Yorkers, or 40%, said they were thinking of moving out of the state, and a small majority were very down on New York, and that's why many of them would think of leaving. And this is common. We see a lot of this type of coverage, and it's one of the more ongoing, interesting subjects. And a lot of people have anecdotal experience that goes into that. I'm going to start by talking about what the sources are that you can really rely on in tracking migration and population trends in New York. There's three main sources, really two principal ones that are watched the most, that are both from governmental sources. One's the Census Bureau. Every year, the Census Bureau's population estimates program includes a release of the total estimated population of every state. These are the intercensal estimates between the decennial census. So, as you know, every year ending in a zero, we have the decennial census, most recently 2020, which purports to count the total population as of April 1st of that year, 2020 in this case. Then every succeeding year, though, and even including 2020, the Census Bureau issues estimates that are meant to establish what the population was as of mid-year at July 1st. That includes what are called components of population change, which can include international migration and net migration, which is the number of people moving into the state minus the number of people moving out to other states. And the third component of that is what's called natural increase, which is a calculation of births minus deaths. Those three factors go into the estimates of population in all of the years in between censuses, which is the so-called intercensal. The Census Bureau also does and releases data annually from the American Community Survey, which, as its name applies, is a survey, it's a statistical sampling, which also, among its reports, includes an annual report on migration, which, unlike the population estimates, also estimates the number where people are headed in terms of domestic migration. How many people from New York, say, are moving to Florida, and how many people from Florida are moving to New York. Second main source, the Internal Revenue Service, does two big statistical data series that are really important. One is their migration data that shows that it assesses how many taxpayers move and don't move and where they move to, and with a breakdown of age and income. from state to state. And that's done now in 2-year pairs. They've been doing this for 30 odd years. They updated it about 12 years ago to make it more accurate. And so the most recent series was 2020-21. The next one will be 21-22. That is people who filed taxes from a different state in 21 than they filed in 2020, or filed from the same state. It counts everybody. There's also statistics of income, which are a breakdown of all the taxes collected in a given state and can help you track how one state relates to another and to national trends. Last but not least, the State Department of Taxation and Finance has its own annual report on analyzing personal income tax returns, which has interesting data that breaks down taxpayers by income category and also by whether they are residents or non-residents or part-year residents, from which you can extrapolate some trends about New York residency. And starting this past year, the tax department began also producing some interesting survey research or some interesting other research they've done based on tax data and on changes of address in taxpayers, which they've posted on their website as quote unquote tax facts. Those are the sources. You'll read things online often based on phone locations, or for instance, you'll read the Allied Van Line Survey or the United Van Line Survey. They produce results consistent with these results, but I would say they're definitely a lesser source, not just because they're not government, but because Allied Van Lines and United Van Lines are telling you how many people move who use a van line, which obviously isn't everyone. It tends to be people who are more affluent or established and have decent jobs or an employer paying for the move, which are people you do want to pay attention to. But for instance, it doesn't catch the recently minted grad student from Wisconsin who gets a little U-Haul and moves his stuff to Long Island, which happens also, and vice versa. So these are the principal data sources. This is a good time to discuss this. Sometime later in this month, probably right before Christmas, the Census Bureau will release its next set of population estimates and components of change for the year ending July 1st, 2023, but just about 6 months ago. That'll be very interesting. We'll get to that later. That's the thing to look out for in the next few weeks, unless without much warning they delay it, which has occasionally happened, but it'll probably be in about 3 weeks. So here's what we see in terms of migration by decade in New York. And actually, the bottom of this chart, this is one of those charts where the whiteout wasn't there, Tim, but the bottom line there is not actually accurate, but exclude that for a minute. And what we have is through 2019, you have every decade's worth of substantial domestic migration. And what the story is basically is from 1970 to 2019, in fact, even further back into the 1960s, New York has been experiencing significant net domestic migration. That is, more people are leaving than moving in from other states. We've consistently been, in terms of the percentage of our base population, the leading state, sometimes rivaled closely by California, but not always. We've had the biggest net domestic migration losses. And as you'll see on this chart, the really record period for outflows from New York was the 1970s, in which there were massive outflows of New Yorkers, averaging over 250,000 a year or more. And net migration, which is domestic minus foreign immigration, people coming into the country, was negative that whole period. By the way, the Census Bureau has techniques for estimating foreign immigration that include estimating illegal as well as legal immigration. And so this is not just people who are formally apply for asylum or citizenship. This is their estimate of all foreign immigrants coming into the state, and New York is one of the biggest states, along with Florida and California and Texas, for immigration inflows, and has been for a long time. So as you see there, this has been a big number for more than 50 years leading up to this decade. And in fact, there were big, strong outflows every time the economy got better. In fact, the outflows increase. And I think that the reason for that, if you think about it, is that it got easy when the economy was strong. It is easier to move and to sell your house, among other things. And it's easier to buy a house because of your prosperity. And so there'd be more movement and more interstate movement in general among all states when the economy has been strong. Here's what the trend looked like by state. And the darkest red is the states that lost the most people. This is in terms of percentage. And as you can see, New York, as a percent of its 2010 census count, it was basically the biggest outmigration loss of any state except Alaska, which I would suggest doesn't really count. Whoops, pardon me. Got to go back a little bit. Because of, and those outmigration trends were what led to the decline in total population in the 70s. Our total population actually went down because of the outmigration losses principally. And most of that loss from the immediate New York City metro area, principally New York City itself, was the biggest source of the drain in the 1970s. Then we have an uptick. The city's recovery paces this, and the state's population goes up steadily up into the early 21st century. So here is where we stood as of, this is actually as of 2020, of the 2020 estimated population, which indicated that after the 2010 census, that the annual estimates said our population had gone up to 2015, and then every year from 2015 to the preliminary estimate for 2020, that is for the year ending July 1st, 2020, the Census Bureau was estimating that the population was dropping quite a bit. This is the trend we were looking at prior to the 2020 census results coming out. Then a surprise, a big surprise. The census had our population up 823,000 residents over 2010, which is our fastest population growth rate since the 1960s, and was a almost 4% swing from that prior census estimate. We thought we were on our way to losing at least 2 congressional seats because of our relative population loss compared to the rest of the country, when in fact we lost only 1. And we were within 90 residents, an incredible small difference. If they had counted just under 90 more people in New York in the 2020 census, we wouldn't have lost any congressional seats. This was the second biggest swing of any state, New Jersey, between the estimate and the final number. New Jersey had a slightly bigger one. Why did it go up so much? Well, the city and the state made a concerted effort to supply the Census Bureau with as many addresses that they thought were missing as possible. That was one reason. There were a lot of efforts by pro-immigration groups to supply immigrants, help them learn how to sign on to the Census Bureau's new, for the first time, online census taking operation. So, of course, the 2020 census also occurred and purported to count people in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But in general, one reason this is up so much, I think a lot of demographers think, is also that the 2010 count was probably lower than reality. And there's information like traffic data and subway ridership, et cetera, to support the supposition that, in fact, there was an undercount in 2010, principally in New York City, that was partially corrected in 2020. So up to 2020, right on the eve of the pandemic, this is what we're looking at. And it's a further increase to an all-time high of over 20 million. Boom. This is what has happened since the pandemic. The estimates since the pandemic show a very significant decrease and a loss of almost everything, or a good part of what we thought was the increase between the 2010 and 2020 census. These are very big decreases. Why did these decreases occur in light of the estimates? The reason is those migration trends that I talked about earlier. This map goes out 2 more years. And what you can see here is we had a loss of 295,000, almost 296,000 residents to other states net between mid-2020 and mid-21. And that's pandemic driven, obviously. And this is the net to other states. That doesn't include movement within New York State. In the second year for which we have data, which came out just about a year ago, net domestic migration ticked up to 299, just under 300,000 residents, which is the second highest level ever. They're just below the record set in the 1970s. So the reason for the population drop is almost entirely due to a big increase in the net outflow of New Yorkers to other states. There was, after a drop, an increase in international foreign immigration, which obviously should go up further in the census estimates for the last year based on the migration inflow to New York City that we've been seeing now, with the source of the migration crisis that the mayor and the governor and all the other leaders of the city and state are concerned about. Okay, so what does our trend look like compared to other states? Here we are again. In terms of total, just in raw numbers, our outflow was exceeded only by California. In terms of percentage, by the way, we were again the biggest of any state. And so here's that chart again with the numbers corrected, because the first version of it I showed was actually had the bottom line wrong. So here's 2020 to 22. And you see that since mid 2020, the outflow has been almost 600,000 people, averaging almost 300,000 a year, which is higher than the peak era in the 1970s. You see that the foreign immigration average is so far been the lowest on record. The net migration loss has been by far the highest. That is domestic migration or foreign immigration minus domestic migration. So this is a very negative trend, obviously. Where were people going within New York State? Well, again, I think we know, many of us, from just our own anecdotal evidence, that it was mainly upstate. You see this here, the city's big net domestic migration losses. This map, if you do this map for any decade leading up to 2020, there's only 2 green counties every year on this map, and they are Saratoga and Ontario. Saratoga has been a booming greenfield county that has been drawing off of the greater capital region, particularly the Albany, Troy, and Schenectady areas, for decades. Ontario plays the same role in the Finger Lakes and south of Rochester. So they are 2 counties that have had consistently positive net domestic migration. They've been the only counties in the state that had it before the pandemic. The green counties in this now are where people, principally from New York City, moved to in the pandemic period, the first 2 years of it. The darkest county there is Otsego County. This is Oneida County. No, that's Oswego County. This is Otsego County. As you can see, we're talking about the mid-Hudson Valley, the upper Catskills, a bit of Oswego County in central New York. Ontario has a continuing inflow, and this is, I believe, Cattaraugus County, which is in the southern tier. Here's a breakdown of the post-pandemic migration by county and also upstate and New York City suburbs. And again, as you can see, the outflow is that outflow that we counted is almost entirely from New York City, and very little of it was from upstate. Now, shifting now to tax data. This is actually the state tax department's chart based on IRS data. And that is, if you go back to the early 90s, what the IRS counted as state-to-state migration in and out of New York going back 30 odd years. And as you can see, there was a big spike in 2020, between 2019 and 2020. Not the largest. The largest was in 2017. Why? Well, that's one of those things that we don't know. The net was smaller, however, because there was also a bigger inflow in between 16 and 17. The IRS data can be a bit funky and can have some odd jumps and falls in New York and other states that are not completely explicable. And that data has been criticized at times by analysts who look at it closely, but it's the best we have. Here's the migration flow in the first pandemic year that the IRS data show. Remember, the IRS hasn't released 21 to 22 yet. That's coming out next spring. This is, again, an old story. The main destination state, net, in terms of net migration from New York, was Florida. The second most common destination state was New Jersey. In fact, our neighboring states combined drew more people than Florida or the immediately neighboring states in the Southeast. But the Florida number has gone up. And there's other aspects of the Florida number that are worth looking at. So this shows where were New Yorkers going based on the IRS count of 262,000 net out migrants. And again, of that net, 20% of them, roughly more than 20% of them, were going to Florida. That's net. Because there were people, in every case, people moved to New York from these states also. This is one of the more striking features of the recent migration flow that the IRS data show. And this is the average income of all people moving out of New York, with an isolated bar here in blue for all of those people moving to Florida. And if you look at this the beginning of this 10-year series, the Florida average income was about the same as the average income of people moving to every state. And then the average income of people moving to Florida begins to tick up. And in 20 to 21 is really much sharply higher. So you've got over $200,000 average income of New Yorkers moving to Florida, 64% jump from the prior year. The average income of all New Yorkers moving is over $100,000. In fact, it was $130,000, which was also an all-time high. So the average incomes of our migrants has been growing steadily and then really jumped during the pandemic. Here's an age breakdown. This is from 1920 data, but the 2021 data are very similar, actually. If you look at all people making an interstate move compared to New York outflow, the age breakdown is almost the same. The inflow to New York tends to be more youthful, though, than the outflow and the all interstate migrant. This is consistent with other data we've seen over the years that shows a lot of young people move to New York, particularly in New York City and the New York City metro area, and that's a long time established trend, and that there tends to be a fairly young cohort that moves to New York City in particular, at least to start out in their careers. Here's a breakout of the high income taxpayers. The highest income category the IRS shows is over $200,000. So again, if you look at people who are New York, who are non-migrants, people who are staying in the same place, U.S., this is the breakdown of people by age of people making over 200,000. Again, New York's very similar, skewing a little younger, but not too far off the national distribution. But look at this migrant difference. All the U.S., everybody in the country making an interstate move, this is the breakdown of people by age who made over 200,000. In New York, a considerably larger segment of the high earners were under age 45, almost 60%, compared to just about 40% in the national cohort. So there's our out migrants with high incomes were younger than those federally. Here's another key graph. This is from another set of IRS data. This is our tax data compared to all states. Our share of income millionaires, who make up a disproportionately large share of our tax base, our share of the nation's income millionaires has dropped quite substantially, and had dropped quite substantially before pandemic, and then dropped really sharply in the pandemic year as well. The red lines is our share of millionaire earner filers. The dotted line is our share of millionaire earner income. Who's been gaining? What states are gaining income millionaires? Well, as you can see here, this is the percent change between 2010 and 2020. Basically, only 4 states added income millionaires more slowly than New York did. And they are states, Oklahoma, that's an oil patch problem, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Connecticut. Those are the states that added income millionaires more slowly than New York State. Even in our region, other states added larger numbers. By the way, in the last 10 to 15 years, Illinois increasingly is almost neck and neck with us in terms of its relative losses in all of these categories. And it has very similar problems economically and in terms of its tax burden. Here's some data the tax department distilled from their own data for their new tax facts series. The outmigration of millionaires has increased in recent years. This isolates simply millionaire earners by New York source income. And this is address changes by income millionaires. This is really striking. I think it speaks for itself. You have a very sharp increase of people moving in 2020. A further increase in 2021, which is lower than 2020, for instance, in the 1 to 5 million category, but still a lot higher than the prior years. This is really striking. When you've got this many people making $25 million or more, and less than 2% of them were moving in 2017 and still barely 2%, a little over 2% in 2019, it's all the way up to just over 8% of them changed their address in 2021. This is a hard count based on that same state reported data. So what are the trends? The trends are we're losing a lot of people. One thing is that outmigration is not new. However, it's intensified and gotten significantly higher since the pandemic. We're awaiting the release of the first new set of data. This will be the census data later this month that show us in general what our net outflows and inflows of foreign immigrants were in the most recent year, that is July 1, 22 to July 1, 23. But this is a trend that bears watching, obviously, because while it's been going on for a long time, the fact that it has stepped up so much and that higher earners are increasingly a larger share of these people is a source of concern, economically and fiscally, in terms of our budgets and our tax base. We've done a lot of work on this, and a lot of these data are based on reports that we filed online and blog posts and other analysis. And this is an address where you can find all of that material, mostly that I did, all accumulated together. So with this, I'll leave you. That's the initial presentation. You can get copies of this. It's been recorded, and I'll take questions if that's okay, Tim.
That is okay.
Okay.
So reminder, you can use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to ask some questions. We've got some in there. I've got a couple to get us started. EJ, you talked a little bit about this in terms of Illinois, and New York and Illinois and California are often grouped together as big blue states that have big problems. The Illinois, and though you were saying in one regard we're really, really close, but in the net migration, Illinois outpaced New York. Is there something more to that, or is this just a story of lots of states with lots of bad problems?
If you have net migration, period, it would be because Illinois gets fewer immigrants than it's net migration combines domestic migration with foreign immigration, and Illinois gets less foreign immigration, although quite a bit, but because of Chicago, but gets less than we do. So their net migration tends to be higher because their domestic outflow, they've got a lot of people moving south, both south and to neighboring Indiana and Wisconsin.
Right.
So that's what's going on with Chicago. Chicago's gotten not Chicago, Illinois, which and a lot of it is Chicago, has gotten steadily, has gone into decline steadily and is kind of breathing down our backs in terms of for low spot on this list.
Which neither of us want.
No.
You addressed this, and a question came in from the audience, which bears repeating. Can you just more directly hit, maybe we don't know for retirement, but we know
right.
The people who are leaving. How much of those who are leaving are retirees or people at the end of their career, as opposed to people who are in their prime or not quite yet prime earning?
It can't be uniformly written off, for instance, even the Florida piece as, well, it's retirees or, well, it's weather. There's a well-known flow that's been going on for a long time. But if you look at the main destination state other than Florida, just for starters, over years, it's New Jersey. New Jersey is the discount dormitory for New York City. So if you got that inflow of young people from other states that are in migration, you get established in New York City, you get your first job, you start doing better, you pair up and have a spouse, you marry your husband or your wife, you're there, and then you're having your first child or your second child, and it's time to move out of the little apartment and you want to get a house in the suburbs, which is still the principal goal. It's not just gentrifying in Brooklyn. Well, the most affordable suburban offerings are in New Jersey for people living in New York City, number one. It's also the most affordable place to get a bigger, more affordable apartment if you work in a blue collar job. And if you are rising, if you started as a janitor somewhere and now you're supervising all of the janitors, or you are driving a truck, but you're now dispatching the trucks, you'll find a better, bigger apartment in North Jersey than you can afford in New York City. So New Jersey, there's a lot of working people move, both working people and rising professional career people move to neighboring states as well as to the suburbs in New York State. There's also a good deal of movement, and you see this from the upstate counties to Florida, of people who are younger but are looking for opportunity, because upstate, the obstacle to staying there is not so much high cost as it is lack of opportunity. If you're in a place that's not creating a lot of new jobs, the land of opportunity is often in the Southeast, Florida and the other states in the Southeast. You have a friend there. We all know people probably in this category. Young people, you have a friend there, your buddy says, "Hey, they need a lot of plumbers down here where I work," or whatever it is. Well, you go down there. That's offers you more promise. So it's not just retirees. And as I showed you, among the high earners, actually retire people 65 and over and pre-retirees 55 to 65 are a lower share of the high earners moving out of New York than they are of people moving nationally.
Yeah, and that's a striking figure. Is there a trend? Governor Lamont in Connecticut says that there is a trend of people moving to Connecticut from New York, and many of those might be commuters. Many of them might just be slowly migrating. Is it a trend? Is it something to continue to be worried about?
I think, and a lot of the smart people whose work I've tried to pay attention to and listen to down in and people at New York City who are experts in this, is that there was what the pandemic brought was it caused a lot of people, and especially mid-career and younger people who were doing well and planning to move eventually, is they accelerated their plans to move. So that young couple I'm talking about who have child one with two on the way or whatever, and they had been thinking that, we got to move when the lease comes up again, we're going to move to the suburbs. Well, and also we had the ability to work from home. Those two things combined. A lot of those people accelerated their plans. They said, "Okay, we're out. We'll leave the apartment now, and we will move to and part Connecticut." Connecticut had a increasingly negative trend, and then had a positive uptick, but quite notable one after the pandemic, which was you can deduce from all of the information we have was largely from New York. The highest earning out migrants from New York tend to be the ones that go from New York City to Connecticut. If you think about it, that's Connecticut property is more expensive. That's where they go. The lowest earning, even the lowest earning among professionals, tend to go to New Jersey. A lot of that was an acceleration. Now, the question is, what we would now tend to expect in domestic migration is that when we get the numbers for 23, that is the second full year after the pandemic, that we're going to come out later this month, the net outflow probably will be lower. It may be quite a bit lower. It'll still be high, but it probably has pulled back quite a lot because you had that outflow that was an acceleration of people who were planning to go anyway, and now it will have subsided. It would be surprising if it isn't down a lot from the last 2 years. That would be something to look for. Because the other thing we saw was in Manhattan in particular, between 21 and 22, Manhattan actually bounced back a little bit. That is, it had a huge loss from 20 to 21, and then bounced back by a very small number in 22. It was one of the few large urban areas to have counties to have that happen. And if you think about it again, anecdotal evidence supports this. People vacated apartments and then people came back. And so that's part of what's going on. I would think you're going to see a bit of watch the December census estimate. And if it would be surprising if it doesn't show our net migration loss to be back down to normal levels, normal being pretty high by national standards, but much lower than the last 2 years.
I don't want to say a dirty word, but there's a 4-letter word that begins with S, which probably has an impact on this. There were SALT cap changes in 2017,
Right.
market tax rate changes that happened in subsequent years. What kind of impact does that have into this? How does it fit into
Well,
with our?
it's almost it's almost too early. It certainly is going to be mixed into the outflow of high earners. If you look at the high earner outflow, the average income of people moving out of New York, according to the IRS data, it began to elevate quite notably in the first 2 years affected by the SALT change, which were the 2018 and 2019 tax years. Although, again, because of the timing of the IRS data, it would really only show up in data for 2019 and 2020. And you're immediately then overwhelmed by pandemic effects. So you don't know how much of it, how much of for instance, millionaires moving to Miami-Dade or Palm Beach County, where to which the I believe it was either Palm Beach County or Miami-Dade. I forgot to pull it up before I came here. People moving from Manhattan to those the average income of people moving there in the pandemic period was actually over $1 million, which is we've never had it, something
Right.
that large. Was that because of SALT? Well, SALT certainly played a role because your effective tax rate went up very significantly in that high bracket. But I think that it's the pandemic created a lot of noise so that some smart statistical analysts out there I'm sure will try to disentangle those effects. It's hard to say. It certainly didn't help, I would express as an opinion.
Well, and we've talked often about sort of people have a cliff that they fall off of when they're making decisions about where to live, and so maybe SALT is one of them. Maybe it has to do
Right,
with lots of things. So
right.
we have a few questions that are trying to get at, I think, what you just addressed, which is, what are the causes of this out migration? And we don't know for sure because we don't talk to those people on their way out. But you can make some obvious assumptions about what's driving people out of state.
Right. I mean, and by the way, it's often addressed simplistically. And I mean, you end up doing battle with battalions of straw men gathered by others. And I was recently at a CBC, the Citizens Budget Commission had a good gathering to look at all of these issues last month. And I was seated on a panel I got to meet Dr. Cristobal Young of Cornell University, who wrote this book before he was at Cornell, actually, I think, right before that, for a few years ago, called The Myth of Millionaire Migration, which was used a very large set of multi-year, like 20 years worth or 15 years worth of IRS data. And he and some colleagues did a study saying that found that statistically found very little correlation in the movement of people making $1 million in any period from high tax states to low tax states, that the tax burden seemed to make no difference, except in the case of Florida, by the way, which is an interesting exception, but which has no income tax. Now that actually makes sense, and I wouldn't dispute most of that. He and I were discussing it in the panel discussion, and this figures because if you're able to make $1 million a year, you're able to make it by working for places for instance, investment banks, which tend to be concentrated still in New York. I mean, wherever you're making your very high income, it tends to be even now pretty place specific. So the stickiness, if you will, of residence for really high earners is something that you wouldn't really dispute. If taxes were the only factor considered by high earners in deciding where to move, New York would have largely emptied out circa late 1970s. So there's a lot of factors, obviously, and that all go into this. And the Census Bureau, by the way, does have this statistical sampling of people. It does a survey. Why did you move? And it tends to be family reasons, family, weather, new job, that economic opportunity. Cost, I don't think taxes are even isolated in that survey, but it tends to be cost of living. I think that you can surmise, and it's not, I don't think across the spectrum of people who argue over these issues, including me, I don't think there's much disagreement that the movement out of the New York City area is a cost based, is largely driven by the high cost of living there. Now, they will often, the people, that is advocates of higher taxes and people I argue with, will say, yes, it's housing. We need more socialized and subsidized housing. That's what it is. It's housing. I point out that a big part of the cost of living that feeds the cost of living throughout downstate in particular is taxes. Taxes is a part of that. Upstate, I think I would suggest, again, it's largely economic opportunity. If you have a region that has been economically stagnant going on now for decades, that's not creating new opportunities at the same level as much of the rest of the country, that's clearly one indication of why people leave there. And by the way, real estate prices, the price of buying a home upstate it's in most upstate metro areas, even post-pandemic, is pretty low or affordable by national standards. So it's not as much a cost issue, although the relative tax rate is high on property taxes. So I think it's opportunity upstate economic, and downstate it's cost of living. And I don't think there's much disagreement on that. I again would be the one pointing out that taxes play a very large role in the cost of living,
Well, and
especially property
there's an
downstate.
escalation there of so how do we get out of this, right? And the Empire Center, and certainly you have done work for years on this issue. And gratuitous plug, if you haven't already, you can find lots of things on our website at empirecenter.org to answer some of these questions. But the state has also taken some steps purportedly that would help alleviate some of these things in their view. Two in particular that some in our audience have asked about is one, Governor Cuomo's plan for free tuition at the SUNY schools, as a way to keep young earners from leaving. And another being sort of the economic development regime, right? Doing big mega projects and helping with technology parks and the state investing in some of these things. Have we seen that work in either instance, or work enough that it's worth the investment?
Second part first, and it's a much longer discussion than we want to get into now. I would say pretty much the evidence is scanned for a net big plus from the economic development programs. You certainly can cite some pretty big spectacular failures, including the so-called Buffalo Billion investment in the Tesla solar panel factory, which has not panned out at anywhere near what it's basically been literally written off as $1 billion loss for the state agency involved in funneling the money. It's open and doing and producing some things, but it's nothing like the scale expected. The biggest the big investment that's produced the most jobs or the most economic development was the Pataki era subsidy, a pretty big subsidy of the chip fab complex in Malta in Saratoga County, which ironically, by the way, was placed in the county that was economically doing the best of any county in upstate New York to begin with. I think that the main policies that have helped, but it haven't been perhaps been in some ways counterproductively. The state, what Governor Cuomo, after saying he wouldn't, sustained a very high level of income tax that had been temporarily enacted under Governor Patterson during a fiscal crisis. He, in effect, used the revenue generated by that tax increase in a deal with the Senate, a working Republican majority at the time, to finance a cut in so-called middle-class tax rates, which actually delivers a few $100s a year saving to middle class defined by downstate standards. The six-figure middle class in the suburbs in New York City, their tax rates were cut in a real but modest way by that tax cut. The biggest favor that I think that in the Cuomo era was done for the state's competitiveness actually was the property tax cap, because there's significantly slower growth in property taxes across the state in the last 10 years because of that cap. And property taxes are a huge part of the tax burden all over the state, particularly on homeowners. New York City is a different case. It doesn't apply to New York City, and New York City's property tax system is a mess and has been subject to a lot of criticism. And needs to be reformed. But outside of New York City, it's been a major plus, and it needs to be continued. But I don't think the state has done enough to generate economic opportunity upstate to keep students. You asked about the Excelsior Scholarship. Here's the thing: there's a demographic trend that is leading to shrinking enrollments. We just had the College of St. Rose in Albany has just announced it's going to close. Now, that demographic, the college-age demographic, has been shrinking. This was predictable as of, going back almost 10 years. What the governor was knowingly doing and not acknowledging was giving SUNY an edge in the competition to keep as many students as possible as the cohort shrank. That has not stopped several SUNY campuses from being on the edge of if they were private, they'd be on the edge of closing. Potsdam has had a crisis. If you look at Potsdam or Fredonia or some of the other upstate SUNY campuses and some of the smaller colleges, they've had big enrollment drops, despite Excelsior. Excelsior was another way of basically targeting savings really to the six-figure middle class of downstate, which is particularly of Long Island and downstate suburbs, which are the main source of students for the SUNY system, which doesn't do particularly well at attracting people from out of state. On net, it probably helped a bit, but it doesn't necessarily help keep them in New York, which has been the big loss from upstate. Upstate has hundreds of thousands of college every few years of people going through private and public colleges upstate, but by and large, they don't stay upstate because there's not enough opportunity to keep them there.
Yeah.
And
So I mean, the answer is no. Is the
right,
short
yeah,
answer to that
right,
question?
short answer.
We're out of time. We have a bunch of questions left, and we'll try
Okay,
to get to some of you afterwards. But you know, just to sort of put a pin on this, it's if I had to summarize, it's not great. But there are ways that the state could take action to sort of subsume some of these issues that have been caused that we think are really structural problems in tax and sort of the business economy. And the Empire Center will continue working on these issues as we have. Again, this is the first in what's going to be a monthly series. So if you listeners have ideas for other things that should be covered, please feel free to reach out and we'll follow up by email, maybe with a survey on this topic. EJ, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I'm sure
you're
we'll have
welcome.
one. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.